Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight we jump back into, I should say this afternoon, we jump back into Bidāyat al-ʿābid wa Kifāyat al-Zāhid by the great Abdurrahman al-Ba'li rahimahullah ta'ala. We're looking at Kitab al-Zakāt, having just concluded Kitab al-Janā'iz, the funeral rites and rituals. Next is all about Zakat. Jumping into the text, the author rahimahullah ta'ala says, شروط وجوبها خمسة أشياء الإسلام والحرية لا كمالها فتجب على مباعض بقدر ملكه وملك النصاب والملك التام وتمام الحول وتجب في مال الصغير والمجنون وهي في خمسة أشياء سائمة بهيمة الأنعام والخارج من الأرض والعسل والأثمان وأروض التجارة ويمنع وجوبها دين ينقص النصاب ومن مات وعليه زكاة أخذت من تركته. Okay, so here the Kitab al-Zakāt, of course, the word Zakat comes from the root word, which means a number of things. One is to grow, to be purified, general praise, or to be beneficial. Okay? So for example, Zaka الزرع إذا نما وزاد is an example of using this word in that context. That the produce increases, right? Zaka, here we're using it as growth when it becomes abundant and flourishes. Also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَالَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى وَقَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, and successful are those who purify it. And here, this is in Surah Al-Shams, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, and that means to purify it from filth or ruin. It also could mean a general praise. فَلَا تُزَكُّوا أَنفُسَكُمْ, as Allah says in Surah Al-Najm, do not praise yourselves. And it also could mean general benefit. For example, رَجُلٌ زَكِيٌّ, it means زَائِدُ الْخَيْرِ, to have abundant goodness with them. The technical usage of the word zakat is much, most of us are familiar with it. It describes the wealth that is distributed. The zakat is the wealth that's distributed. And zakat, of course, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's obligated during the days of Medina. Some say during the 2nd year of the Hijrah calendar. The wealth that's given is called zakat because it increases the remainder of what it's taken from and protects it from calamities, as some of the scholars have explained it, incorporating the various meanings of zakat, not only understanding the technical meaning of the actual wealth itself, but it was called zakat because it purifies a person's wealth, purifies it, and it increases the remainder of what was left behind. We can find this in the Quran in Surah At-Tawbah. خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا. Take from their wealth a charity by which you purify them and elevate them thereby. Surah At-Tawbah, this is verse number 103. Right, so it purifies the one who pays it from sin and increases their reward. And it also helps the poor grow and flourish. Those that are recipients of zakat are going to benefit tremendously from that wealth. So the Imam says here, what I just read to you, zakat is obligatory when 5 conditions are met. So these are the conditions that must be met in order for it to be wajib. The first is Islam. Freedom, though not complete, such that it is due upon one partially enslaved in proportion to what he owns of himself. Possession of the niṣāb, that's number 3. Complete ownership, number 4. And completion of the hawl, which is the zakat year. So that's 5 obligations or conditions for obligation. Islam here, meaning the owner of the wealth has to be Muslim for zakat to be obligatory upon them. So a disbeliever is not obliged to pay zakat, even if they happen to be an apostate, وَلِيَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ, having left the religion. Freedom here, talking about hurriya. So in general, zakat is not obligatory upon someone that is enslaved or is a bond servant. A person who is partially free, manumitted, which is considered like mu'taq ba'dahu. Right? So they have like an arrangement of sorts where they're partially free in that they are free to move about and to possess some wealth, and then they're partially still in bondage. So they would pay zakat according to the proportion of their freedom. So if they owned zakātable wealth, the zakat is due on whatever share they owe based on the nature of their freedom. Right? It's a partial ownership, if you will, or a partial amount of it is zakātable in proportion to that. You know, like 50%, like they're working off or working a deal in which they have reached this agreement, then they would pay their zakat based on the percentage of that agreement. Ownership of the niṣāb is talking about the minimum threshold, and this is approximately determined in terms of gold and silver. There's also trade goods that are evaluated, certain conditions met. So zakat would be obligatory based on having a minimum amount, possessing a certain amount of wealth, and then, of course, anything beyond that, you would have to also pay zakat on that total. So essentially what it means is if you dip below the niṣāb, then zakat is not an obligation. So, for example, if we were to say that the niṣāb is $350, if you had $350 or more in your possession, then you would meet this condition. If you had $150 in your possession, you wouldn't meet the minimum niṣāb, and therefore a zakat wouldn't be obligatory upon you. Which gets us into the next, is you have to have complete ownership over that wealth, such that no one else can lay claim to it, and you can dispose of it as you wish. It belongs to you exclusively. You have access to it, outright access to that wealth, as opposed to it being tied up somewhere else. You don't have complete access to it. Sometimes they talk about like the 401k plan, for example, where it's your wealth, it's just tied up and you don't have free access to it, and if you did, you would be penalized for it. And there's some scholarly debate as to whether you would pay zakat on a 401k plan based on the access that you have to it. So that gives you kind of a modern day application to this particular point. The fifth one is the completion of 1 lunar year, tamamul hawl. 1 lunar year is the time period which you have to have possession of the niṣāb, basically. Calculate your zakat year based on that lunar calendar. So once you come into possession of that minimum amount, let's again go back to $350. Once you've reached that minimum amount within your possession, free and clear, having met the previous conditions, Muslim, free, etc., $350, Rabi al-Awwal, it's the 20th of the month right now. So that's when my niṣāb, my hawl would begin. And then I would come back to the following year. When we got back to completing a lunar year, I would remember I'd mark this down in my little zakat diary that I have handy. Yeah. And say, hey, we met the niṣāb. And then I'd come back and say, all right, are we still above the niṣāb? And if we are, then I take what I have in excess of that and I calculate my zakat. So that gives you just a general concept of what it looks like to meet these 5 conditions. He says it's obligatory upon the wealth of both minors and the insane, those that aren't of sound mind. It applies to 5 categories of wealth: grazing livestock, what emerges from the earth, honey, currencies, and trade goods. Okay, so pasturing livestock, this is cattle, camels, and sheep or goat. That's what we're referring to there. Other types of animals, no. Agricultural produce, We're going to get into the details of some of this, including grains, fruits, and anything harvested from the earth. Honey and minerals and buried treasure. Gold and silver, as we know, those are forms of currency. And then trade goods. These are things that you have in your possession in order to sell, like commercial commodities. Okay? So zakat's not obligatory on other forms of wealth unless those forms of wealth are intended for trade, like your house or your car, clothes and things that you have in your possession. That is considered wealth. But they don't fall in these categories unless they became now objects of sale. And then they would be subject to zakat rules. So anything else, like other animals, like donkeys, horses, mules, birds, jewels, weapons, manufacturing tools, those types of things aren't going to be considered as zakātable wealth, even though they are wealth, they're forms of possessions. Its obligation is waived by a debt that reduces the niṣāb. So if you have a debt, so if you were to say, we went back to our calculation of let's say $350, we have much more than that in our possession. And then let's say we had $1,000 in our possession at the end of our zakat year, and then when it was time to make the calculation and determine how much we're going to pay, we'd first say, well, wait a minute. I know I have $1,000, so I'm in excess of the niṣāb. It's been a whole lunar year. We're all good there. Everything checks out. But I have a debt. I owe somebody money, which means now I have to detract that debt from what I possess. And if it now brings me below the niṣāb, then I'm not obliged to pay. So I have to pay off the debt, essentially, before I fulfill my obligation of paying zakat. If my debt is less than, is not going to dip me below the niṣāb, so again, $1,000, I have a $500 debt, I'll obviously subtract the $500 debt from my total amount, which would leave me with $500. So now I'm going to pay zakat on that remaining $500. And the $500 excess that I had of my $1,000, I'm going to use that to repay my debt. If you're able to track your wealth by its tangible, specific thing, right? This wealth here, and then I have other. You understand? Then you can have multiple years going, multiple calendar years going. If you were able to track, like here's a wealth here, like here's some gold here and some gold here, and I came into like that, you could potentially have zakat on things themselves. It can get complicated. So the best way to handle that, the most practical way is, once you reach the niṣāb, you start your calendar. Don't look at what happens between the year, up, down, and around, whatever happens. You come back to the beginning of that, or the end of that, how of that year, then you take a look again, and you see where you are. Are you up, or are you down? Okay, so the next point that he mentions here, whoever dies while zakat is due for them, it's taken from their estate. Meaning whatever they would typically have set for inheritance to go out, or otherwise, then this first would be detracted from that. Even if they didn't make a bequest saying, pay my zakat. Even if they didn't and give instruction is not required to fulfill this obligation. So that would be taken from their estate first, and then their estate would be distributed according to the rules of distribution. He goes on in the next portion here to talk about the livestock. He says, وَشُرِطَ فِي بَهِيمَةِ الْأَنْعَامِ أَن تُتَّخَذَ لِلدُّرِّ وَالنَّسْلِ وَالتَّسْمِينِ لَا لِلْعَمَلِ وَأَن تَرْعَى الْمُبَاحَ أَكْثَرَ الْحَوْلِ وأن تبلغ نصابا فأقل نصاب الإبل 5 وفيها شاة وفي عشر شاتان وفي 15 3 شياه وفي 20 4 شياه وفي 25 بنت مخاض وهي التي لها سنة وفي 36 بنت لبون وهي التي لها سنتان وفي 46 حقة وهي التي لها 3 سنين وفي 61 جذعة وهي التي لها 4 سنين وفي 76 بنت لبون وفي 91 حقتان وفي 121 3 بنات لبون ثم في كل 40 بنت لبون وفي كل 50 حقة. So here this is pretty straightforward. First, he says, as for livestock, there are 3 conditions. Remember we talked about livestock before. We said they were camels, cows, and sheep or goat. Okay, so the livestock, 3 conditions must be met. Number 1, they must be kept for milk, for offspring, meaning breeding, or fattening. They'll be consumed or sold that way, not for labor. So these aren't working animals. And they must graze on permissible pasture for the majority of the year. And they must reach the niṣāb. So these are the 3 conditions. Again, for milk, offspring or fattening, animals that are used for work, like riding, plowing, or are rental animals that are used for work, are exempt from zakat. Okay? So the Prophet ﷺ said there is no zakat on working animals. And they must graze on permissible pasture for most of the year. So zakat only applies if they freely graze, meaning they're not fed by the owner. The owner is not supplying them the food. This is for the majority of the year. And this also accounts for natural disruptions that might occur, like if there's snow or there's rain, and you do have to supplement a little bit, but the majority of the time they're freely grazing. And this ensures fairness to both the owners as well as the poor. So if they're fed by the owner has to buy feed, or the animals are fed unlawfully, then zakat is not due for most of the year. They must reach the niṣāb, which is the basic minimum threshold, as the 3rd condition. So here, without getting into any details, the Imami says the lowest niṣāb for camels is 5, for which 1 sheep is due. So here, what he's giving you is amounts. 5 camels is a threshold. What's due on 5? Camels, 1 sheep. For 10, meaning camels, there are 2 sheep. For 15, there are 3 sheep. For 20, there are 4 sheep. For 25, 1 she-camel aged 1 year. For 36, 1 she-camel aged 2 years. For 46, meaning 46 camels, 1 she-camel aged 3 years. For 61, 1 she-camel aged 4 years. For 76, 2 she-camels aged 2 years. For 91, 2 she-camels aged 3 years. For 121, 3 she-camels aged 2 years. Thereafter, for every 40, 1 2-year-old she-camel. And for every 50, 1 3-year-old she-camel. So that gives you the amounts and what's due based on those amounts of animals. The next section, he says, وَأَقَلُّ نِصَابِ الْبَقَرِ 3 وَفِيهَا تَبِيءٌ وَهُوَ مَا لَهُ سَنَةٌ وَفِي 40 مُسِنَّةٌ لَهَا سَنَتَانِ وفي 60 تبيعان ثم في كل 30 تبيع وفي كل 40 مسنة وأقل نصاب الغنم 40 وفيها شاة من المعز لها سنة واحدة أو جذعة من الضأن لها 6 أشهر وفي 121 شاتان وفي 201 3 شياه وفي 400 4 شياه ثم في كل 100 شاة شاة في كل 100 شاة شاة. Okay, so here the next topic is the cattle. and sheep. So the minimum niṣāb for cattle is 30, for which one 1-year-old bull is due. For 40, one 2-year-old cow. For 60, two 1-year-old bulls. Thereafter, for every 30, one 1-year-old bull is due, and for every 40, one 2-year-old cows. The minimum niṣāb for sheep or goats is 40, for which one is due, either a 1-year-old goat or a 6-month-old lamb. For 121, 2 are due. For 201, 3. For 404, thereafter, for every 101 is due. And then the last line in this section, it reads, وَالْخُلْطَةُ بِشَرْطِهَا تُصَيِّرُ الْمَالَيْنِ كَالْمَالِ الْوَاحِدِ. So this is actually a rather lengthy topic. Imam al-Ba'li, of course, just giving us a concept here that combining of two properties, when meeting its conditions, renders them as one. And what this means is that if 2 or more people own livestock together and their animals graze together, drink together, and rest together, they are treated as one herd when calculating zakat. So you got some sheep and I have some sheep, and because we're friends and it makes business sense and it's for convenience factors, we just get our herds together and we just take care of them together. They graze together. They're taken care of like that. Then when we calculate zakat, we're going to calculate them together as a single herd. Even though each person owns their own share, the zakat is calculated in that manner, as if it's one owner, and then it's divided fairly between them based on the herd size. And this only applies to grazing livestock, not to any other type of wealth, this type of khulta, this mixing, if you will. And only when there's other conditions that have to be met. As I mentioned, it's a rather lengthy chapter, something that you would study, of course, in greater works, especially if you were into livestock, if that was your deal. Okay, and I realize that most people, that's not their deal today. And so right now, it's just kind of like theory. So we're not going to give it much more than that. The next section, فصل, he says, تجب الزكاة في كل مكيل مدخر من حبه من قوت البلد وغيره فتجب في كل الحبوب كالحنطة والشعير والأرز والحمص والجلبان والعدس والترمس والكرسنة وبزر القطن والكتان وبزر الرياحين والقثاء لا في نحو جوز وطين وعناب ولا في بقية الفواكه كالتفاح وإجصاص وكمثرى ونحو ذلك. So here we're talking about earthly yields. Earthly yields he's beginning the chapter on what emerges from the earth. What do you got? You got something for me? No. Oh, okay.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah. Oh, look at it, yeah. So here, the section begins a chapter on what comes from the basically kharāj al-ard, min kharāj al-ard, whatever comes out of the earth emerges from the earth, and this includes crops, fruits, minerals, buried treasure. That's right. We're going to be looking at some rikāz, some treasure, and whatever falls under a similar ruling like honey. And the basis for the obligation of zakat and such items you can find in the Quran when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَنفِقُوا مِنْ طَيِّبَاتِ مَا كَسَبَتُمْ وَمِمَّا أَخْرَجْنَا لَكُمْ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ. Okay, Surah Al-Baqarah 267. All you who believe, spend from the good things you have earned and from what we have brought forth for you from the earth. So zakat is obligatory upon every measured and storable item, such as grains and staple foods. It is due on all grains such as wheat, barley, rice, garbanzo beans, sweet peas, lentils, lupins, and herbals, as well as seeds such as cotton, flax, basil, and cucumber. It is not due on the likes of nutmeg, figs, jujube, and other fruits such as apples, amberella, and pears. Okay, this is introducing another concept to us. about the various types of grains, fruits, seeds, herbs. So check this out. Zakat is obligatory. Just to give you like a, let's kind of bring this together in a summary, more organized fashion here. General principle is that zakat is obligatory on items that are measured by volume, makil, okay? في كل مكيل, they're measured by volume. مدخر, and they're storable over time, which means something fresh that would go off, like an apple, as he describes. It's not going to be zakatable because it's going to spoil. The idea for zakat is to keep wealth from stagnating in the market, being held. So that's 1 and 2, measurable by volume and storable over time. And the categories that he highlights, they include staple grains, wheat, barley, rice, millet, corn, lentils, chickpeas, sweet peas, lupins, mung beans, etc. Dried fruits and nuts like dates, raisins, almonds, hazelnuts, pistachios, all your favorite stuff. Measurable oil seeds and spices, sesame, black seed, cumin, coriander. Leaves and herbs that have been dried and cultivated that are measurable by volume, perhaps like sidr or thyme or those types of things. So items that are not zakatable would be, as I mentioned, perishable fruits. He points out a couple of those: apples, bananas, eggplants, cucumbers, etc. Fresh herbs that will go off like mint or basil, they have to be dried first. Flowers and fragrances, those types of things aren't going to be zakatable. Various other miscellaneous things that would be harvested. The zakat is only due if they're sold and the earnings reach the niṣāb as a lunar year passes, or they could. So that's how zakat would be retrieved from those types of items. Zakat is due if they're sold, and then the earnings reach the niṣāb, and now we're basically dealing with the money that was earned off of such a sale. He says, بِشَرْطَيْنِ أَحَدُهُمَا أَنْ يَبْلُغَ نِصَابًا وَقَدْرُهُ بَعْدَ تَصْفِيَةِ حَبٍّ وَجَفَافِ ثَمَرٍ 5 أوسق وهي 300 صاع والوسق 60 صاع والصاع 5 أرطال وثلث بالعراق وهي 342 رطلا و6 أسباع رطل بالدمشق والثاني ملكه وقت وجوبها وهو في الحب اشتداده وفي الثمر بدو صلاحه ولا يستقر إلا بجعلها في بيدر ونحوه ويجب العشر فيما سقي بلا كلفة ونصفه فيما سقي بها وثلاثة أرباعه فيما سقي بهما فإن تفاوتا اعتبر الأكثر نفعا ونموا مع الجهل ومع الجهل العشر. Khair, we have a dense passage here. It reads that there are 2 conditions. First, that it reaches the niṣāb. So the previous categories we talked about have to reach the niṣāb. What is the niṣāb of these types of items? Measurable and storable food types or seeds, etc. He says it is 5 wasqs. It's a wasq, after sifting grain and drying fruit. That is 300 saws. 1 wasq equals 60 saws, and 1 saw equals 5 1/3 Iraqi pounds, which is equivalent to 342 6/7 Damascene pounds. You're looking at it like, what? Yeah. So that's something that during the time of the author, around that time, would be a common, probably, forms of units of measure for them. Sa'a is a volume. A sa'a is a volume. It's not a weight. Okay, but they converted it into weights because that's what became typical for people to measure things by. Like whenever we get around to Zakat al-Fitr and we talk about what the amount is, Zakat al-Fitr is measured in a volume. It means it occupies a space. We're not interested in the weight of it because various different foodstuffs weigh different things. Some are denser and some are less dense, so it impacts the weight. So you're trying to give a volume of food as opposed to like a handful of dates is going to be much heavier than a handful of oats. It's going to be very much more dense, the dates are typically, than the oats. Okay? But we still want to be able to give the same type of volume here. You can convert into a unit of weight, but it's like going to be based on averages and not based on, not considering what's outliers, like the more dense or the lighter version of these things. We're going to be looking at what is considered average, okay? So when we take a look at this passage, the measure, as I said, originally based on volume, converting it to weight, according to today's standards, it's equivalent to 612 kilograms, or approximately 1,350 U.S. pounds of average quality wheat. That's the niṣāb. Okay? That's all of that, what we just said, 60, the 5 boss, 60, he's converting units into units into units to give people the understand, like, if you're familiar with any of these units, grasp it, and that's what it is. What we would say is that it reaches the niṣāb, which is approximately 1,350 U.S. pounds of average quality wheat. That's the measure of weight that you'd be looking for, the equivalent of that. Second, that one possesses it at the time zakat becomes due. So this is different than the hawl here. Okay, this is different than waiting a lunar year. For these items, there is a time in which they become due, as he defines grain at the point of hardening and fruit at ripening. That's when zakat's due on those items, with the obligation not finalized until gathered onto a threshing floor or its like. Basically, once it's harvested and gathered and then brought to where it's normally sorted. So there's a transport process that happens. So it becomes an obligation when it reaches this point, it's hardened or the fruit's ripened, and then now it becomes required for it to be dispersed once it reaches that point, right? Because it takes into consideration potential scenarios between the harvesting location and the threshing floor or the area of sorting, because something could happen between here and there. And that gets into another topic of discussion altogether. The concept, however, is delivered here by Imam al-Ba'li, giving us the idea of when the obligation is kind of beginning and when it becomes finalized. So essentially, zakat on crops and fruits become obligatory when a Muslim owner possesses the minimum zakatable amount, the niṣāb, at the time the crop reaches its maturity. So when does zakat become obligatory? For grains, when they harden on the stalk, and for fruits, when they become ripe, they become edible. And there's a key point here that it doesn't matter who planted it. What matters is who owns it at the moment of ripening and hardening. This is the legal trigger to obligate zakat for these items, is that you own it at the time of its obligation. It doesn't even require an intention to be planted. It could be that some seeds were planted on your land, like they flew in the wind, and then there they were on your land, and those things, they basically grew, and now there's a harvest. They're yours. You have to pay zakat on them. Okay? Spontaneous crops, wheat or barley grows, seeds accidentally fly, that's what we would call it, a spontaneous crop. You still have to pay because you own it at the time of ripening. Zakat is not obligatory, even if the crop or fruit is zakatable in general. Ownership timing matters, so this is when it's not obligatory. It's past the due time of its obligation. You come into ownership after that point. It's already ripe. The person that owned it when it was ripe, they have to pay the zakat. You come into possession later, afterwards, maybe it was a gift, it was inheritance, or it was made as a payment to you, you don't pay zakat on that. Or if you buy or trade it after it's been ripened. They've already harvested, it's done, and then you buy it now as a crop from them, as a product, there's no zakat for you. They have to pay zakat on that, and now you have it in your possession. What you do with it next will determine how you deal with it. If you harvest someone else's crop and take a portion as wages, there's no zakat on that share. So you're there and you're getting paid basically in crop. Or wild or unknown plants. For example, you're out in the wild and you're gathering herbs and shrubs and plants and things on public land. You happen to go get these things. The ownership begins only after picking, and that's after the point when zakat would have been due. So you went out there and you found the stuff's already ripened, it's already done. It's once you take hold of that is when you've taken ownership of it. So the time of obligation is already passed, because you're not typically plucking these fruits off of the public lands and stuff or out in the wild unless you're probably going to eat it. It's consumable. The next section here has to do with how it was irrigated. So 1/10 is due, like how much is due on these items. 1/10 is due for what is irrigated without effort. Half of that for what is irrigated with effort, and 3/4 of a tenth for what is irrigated by both. If the two methods are equal, the one yielding greater benefit and growth is considered. If unknown, 1/10 is due. So here with this, we're taking a look at the considerations of the Islamic law in how crops are irrigated when we calculate the zakat. So essentially, when crops are irrigated naturally, it's free. Like, there's no human effort involved, no animals, no machinery. There's rain. There could be like flooding, groundwater. So this doesn't involve a process for you, or you don't incur any cost, and so the zakat amount is 10%. It's higher, as if you had to irrigate the crop. You had to supply the water. You had to, for example, transport water in buckets. You had to use pumps. You had to use animals. You had to use machinery. You had to, put in irrigation systems, etc. Because this involves work and expense, the zakat amount now drops to 5%. Instead of the full 10. If it's a combination of this and that, then it's 7.5% if both methods are used equally. If one method was used more, then the rate follows whichever one gave more benefit to the crop. If it becomes unclear, you're not sure, like which one was used more or which one gave about more benefit in terms of irrigation, then you stick with the default of 10%. So that you can be sure that your obligation is fulfilled. Basically, you're covering your doubt with certainty. And that's a general principle in Islam. And so basically the ruling here encourages fairness and acknowledges both the blessing of natural resources, having rainwater, etc. And then it also acknowledges the cost that can be burdened or shouldered by human labor. The next section, and this is the last section we're going to look at for today, he ends here with وَيَجْتَمِعُ أُشْرٌ وَخَرَاجٌ فِي أَرْضٍ خَرَاجِيَّةٍ وَهِيَ مَا فُتِحَتْ عَنْوَةً وَلَمْ تُقْسَمْ بَيْنَ الْغَانِمِينَ غَيْرَ مَكَّةَ كَمِصْرَ وَالشَّامِ وَالْعِرَاقِ وفي العسل العشر سواء أخذه من موت أو من موات أو مملوكة ونصابه 160 رطلا عراقية ومن استخرج من معدن نصابا بعد سبك وتصفية ففيه ربع العشر في الحال وفي الركاز وهو الكنز ولو قليلا الخمس يصرف مصرف الفيء ولا يمنع من وجوبه دين وباقيه لواجده ولو أجيرا لا لطلبه. So here we're talking about a combination of land as well as what's harvested from the land. So he says the 10th, we're just talking about the 10th, right? The 10% of what is to be given from the harvest of the land is combined with the land tax. So يجتمع عشر وخراج في أرض خراجية. So here basically he's pointing out the fact that two payments can be occurring at the same time. You pay the zakat on the produce, and then you have to pay the tax on the land, a kharaji land that is. And he defines what that is as land conquered by force and not distributed to the fighters. Excluding Mecca, dispute over whether the Mecca was conquered by force, or even if it's something that would be considered as such because the Prophet ﷺ made it a haram. An example of lands that were conquered in this manner, such as Egypt, Sham, the Levant, and Iraq. All right, so basically, you have these two types of financial duties. Al-Ushur on produce, that's the 10th. This is an obligation paid for the crops that grow in the land, as we've described, based on how they're irrigated. And then you have a land tax. And this is essentially a public levy set by the Muslim ruler on certain types of lands. So these two obligations they can apply at the same time if the land is classified as kharaji. Kharaji land, as he mentions here, conquered by Muslim armies by force. They're left in the hands of their original owners or tenants, basically to work, so they're not distributed to the soldiers. So essentially what that looks like is the Muslim army has conquered a region. You might recognize this from the story of Khaybar. And you basically come up with this arrangement where they're allowed to continue to live on the land to work it, but they have to pay a tax because now they're living on the land of the state. And if they're on that land and they're farmers and they're producing agriculture, then they're going to pay their 10% of zakat. So if they're Muslims, for example, if they actually come into possession or renting that space or whatever, then they're going to come up with now not only the kharaji part of it, but also the ushur. So the tax for the land is paid regardless whether something's planted or not. And then, of course, if they're, again, farming the land, then they have to deal with that. It's almost two separate things. It's two separate dues, one on the land and one on the produce. So the kharāj benefits the state, the tax for the land, and the zakat benefits the poor. So the kharāj is due for owning and benefiting, or being on and benefiting from the land, and the zakat is due based on the crops and how they're harvested, etc., has been explained. He goes on here and he says that honey, we read that part, honey is subject to zakat at 1/10, whether collected from uncultivated or owned land, and its niṣāb is 160 Iraqi pounds. Basically, that means 61.2 kilos or approximately 135 US pounds. 135 US pounds of honey. If you were to harvest 135 pounds of honey or more, whether you got it from like out in the wild, uncultivated lands, or owned land. You went on somebody's property and they're like, you can harvest the honey, I don't care. Once you've harvested the honey and you gather 135 pounds, then you have to pay 1/10 of that in zakat. Whoever extracts the niṣāb of minerals after smelting and purification must pay 1/40 immediately. 1/40 is 2.5%. So we're talking about niṣāb of minerals now. Minerals would be like gold and silver, copper, etc. They refer to any natural deposit in the earth which is not of the earth itself. Any, like dirt. We're not going to extract dirt and then pay zakat on the dirt. This is going to be the minerals that we've kind of come to know and understand. And so the scholars, they give examples of these things in other works. Gold, silver, anything that reaches the niṣāb, the minimum threshold of zakat, like sulfur, lead, topaz, rubies, also petroleum. Yes. So, when you start extracting petroleum like crude oil, once it's extracted, there's zakat, 2.5% on that. Salt, similar substances if it's brought out from the earth after smelting and purification. So here when it comes to like the solids, you don't calculate the zakat until you've smelted it, meaning you remove the impurities from it, because it could be like gold mixed with other things that aren't zakātable minerals, things that are of value. They could be something that possess no value, and it's mixed with these things, so you would have to smelt it. Means basically like it's melted down, and those things are burned out. The impurities are burned out of that metal, and they're purified, and then you would take the weight of it. So you are looking for it wasn't al-khalis, right? The pure weight of that particular mineral. 1/4 of 1/10, 2.5% must be given, whether the output is in the form of the substance itself or its monetary equivalent. So either you pay what that is, you give away 2.5% of that item, or you do an equivalency of the market value and you pay it in money. So again, extracted minerals, things that are coming from the earth, metals, salt, stones, resins even, oil, as long as it's not planted or grown like a crop, then once it's extracted and purified, immediately zakat is due. You don't wait for a year. You pay right then and there. So it has to reach the niṣāb, gold or silver, either the equivalent of either. The niṣāb is based on gold or silver, an equivalent of that, either of gold or silver's niṣāb. And the way that you look at that typically is whichever one is lesser in value, right? Because the gold price might be way up there. It might be like $5,000 to reach the niṣāb, whereas silver today might be like $200 and some. So you would consider the smaller amount in order for the wealth to benefit the community. How much is paid? Again, 2.5%. This applies to all those things that I mentioned here: crude oil, mercury, gold, copper, etc. So if you have a well, an oil well, then you have to keep track of what's being extracted, especially if it's a private one and you're extracting it yourself, or a private company. Something that is a product of the state, it already belongs to the state, and there may be some specific rules in regards to how that's handled for public resource purposes. The last part we look at here is known as rikāz, and this is buried treasure. Even if a little bit, 1/5 is due. 1/5 is 20%, and it's distributed as fay, meaning to the benefit of the state. Its obligation is not waived by debt. So we talked about before, if you have a debt, you detract the debt from the amount of wealth, and then you calculate. Here, we're not going to waive that based on a debt. So if you have all of a sudden found a treasure that's worth $500, you're not going to go, well, wait a minute, I have a $1,000 loan, so that wipes this off. I don't pay zakat on it. This is right away. You just look at it, it's 500. We're taking 20% off the top, giving that for zakat. The rest of it, either we're keeping it or we're giving it to our employer, if the employer hired me to hunt for treasure. And that's what he mentions next. The remainder belongs to the finder, even if an employee, so long as he was not hired specifically to search for it. So you could be an employee, you were employed to dig a well or to erect a fence or a wall. And while you're out there digging around on the land, you bump into this rikāz, you've unearthed it, it's yours. Unless I've employed the person because I want you to search for this treasure on my property. Now you're just an ala, you're like a tool of mine that I've employed. And so what you find belongs to me, and I pay that zakat, and you just get paid the wage that I've given you. You see the difference between the two? One person's there to build a fence, not to find treasure. They stumble on the treasure, it's theirs to find it. Second person is there to find the treasure. I've hired them. They're mine. I get the benefit because I'm paying for that service. They find it, then I get it. That's what they're after, and that's what the Imam is making the distinction of in regards to who owns the rest of the treasure once the 20% is paid on that rikāz, on that buried treasure. And buried treasure here refers to pre-Islamic treasure troves, wealth that was buried during Jahiliyyah. If someone finds a hoard of this type, they would know of it based on the engravings on the coins or the various items showing the signs of disbelief without any indication of it being from a Muslim, of Islam. That's when zakats do on it. Because if you find you find a treasure and there's an indication that it's owned by a Muslim, now we're dealing with a different thing altogether. There's a rightful owner for that, or it's inherited wealth that belonged to a rightful owner of that, and we have to figure out whose that is. It's like a lost item at this point. Right? If it contains Islamic signs that were Muslims there, it's not considered rikāz. And if there's no owner for it, it can go to the general public. And that's where we wrap up for today. And we'll pick up here next time, looking at currencies, gold and silver, etc., various things of value that may be a little more applicable to the world we live in, jewelry, possessions, etc. Until next time, Jazakallah khair, wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana, alhamdulillah.